In the winter before his crucifixion, Jesus brought his disciples to Caesarea Philippi, and there he revealed to them for the first time that he was indeed the promised Jewish Messiah. Now, the city of Caesarea Philippi, which is also known as the ancient Panaeus, was situated on a terrace at the foot of Mount Hermon, which is in the north, about 30 miles past the Sea of Galilee. The area had an unusually beautiful setting. It was very lush, it was full of life, and it's always been one of the main sources of the Jordan River. In fact, Josephus, a first century historian, stated that he believed that it was the main source of the Jordan River. Well, why did Jesus take his disciples all the way up there? What was he getting at? And how does it have anything to do with the promises of God and then our response as the people of God? Sometimes when we read the Bible, it's so easy to miss much of what was really going on and much of what Jesus was originally communicating because we don't tend to know the culture and we haven't studied the background of the situation. Well, that's one of the major advantages of getting on the ground where these things occurred and then learning from the setting. I think it's really hard to understand the entirety of the words of this particular account in Matthew 16 without understanding the world that it occurred in. So, let's pack up and go check it out. Caesarea Philippi has been an incredible location for several reasons since the second millennia BC. The overall beauty of the location, the political history of the area, and the pervasive religious focus of the area all come into focus when you visit here. So before we dig into the promises that were made here, I want to walk through a little bit of the background. You see, very early on, this region had a strong focus on religious belief, but it didn't have anything to do with the one true God. Before Israel entered the land around 1400 BC, the Canaanites lived here. And they lived here at Panaeus, and they built up a temple to their god of fertility and crops, the god Baal. Later, when the Greeks came into the area, they built temples as well to the god Pan, which is where we get the name Panaeus. And specifically near the cave, which is behind me, it became known as the Cave of Pan. Later, when the Romans had conquered Palestine, they built shrines and temples to the god Pan and to Caesar. And this became a notable area for the worship of false gods. And even today, the shelves where idols were displayed, they still remain. So this was the seat of idol worship at the time of Jesus. You would come here to worship the Roman Emperor, Caesar's, hence its name, Caesarea. You could worship a myriad of different gods here, all depending on what you needed. So Jesus brings his disciples here to the very seat of what would seem like the enemy to declare who he is. There's one other curious note. The water that flows behind me here today has been flowing for a long time, but historians record that several earthquakes have affected what we see today. Earthquakes are common in this area of the world, and when they occur, they usually leave a mark. Well, one earthquake in the late 1st century changed this particular area. Before then, there was a deep pool of water from which the water that's flowing now used to flow. But unfortunately, when the earthquake occurred, some rocks fell. And some of the people who write about this particular area say that this pool was so deep that all of the ropes that they had, they tied together and they couldn't even reach the bottom. And so it's believed that, and written about, that this area was even called by some the gates of Hades. So why did Jesus take them to Caesarea? I mean, what was he getting at? Well, the answer is found in the knowledge of the background, and also it's found in the text. See, Matthew records that as they approached the city, Jesus asked his disciples who the people said that Jesus was. Now, it's a curious question unless you're fishing for compliments or you're setting up another question, and it sure seems to me that Jesus wasn't fishing for compliments. So the disciples responded like this. They said, "Some say that you are John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets." In other words, they answered and said, they think that you're some sort of special messenger or prophet from God, and maybe we should pay attention to what you say, but that's really about it. Now, rather than correcting or challenging them, Jesus instead asked them another and more personal question. He said, "But what about you? Who do you say that I am?" So here, he was setting them up. He was setting them up so he could ask them what they really believe about him. Jesus brought his disciples to the very place where paganism, emperor worship, and all sorts of false worship was taking place in Israel. He brought them to Caesarea Philippi, and then he revealed to them who he was. Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, son of Jonah, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." So Peter spoke up and said that Jesus was the Messiah. And Jesus didn't correct him. I mean, think about that. Technically, Jesus and Peter should have been killed for blasphemy right then and there if Jesus wasn't the Messiah. Jewish tradition would absolutely require that. But that's not what happened. Jesus instead confirmed that he was the Messiah. And he does so right here in enemy territory, right in Caesarea Philippi. That's an incredible thought. If I was going to reveal something that people might want to kill me for, I don't think I'd be going to the seat of power for my enemies. I'd probably do it in secret, but instead, Jesus went to the seat of the power and authority of the false gods. Now, why would he do this? Well, I think he did it because he wasn't afraid. And he wanted his disciples to see that they don't need to be afraid either. So let's look at the promise that Jesus made. From this place, Jesus said, "You're right, Peter, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build my church, and the gates of Hades will not ever prevail against this new movement, this ecclesia, this Jesus movement." Here's why I think that's so powerful from this location. Again, the seat of false worship taking place here. And God says in the very place, Jesus says in the very place that's known as the gates of Hades, nothing's going to stop this new movement. Now, let's think about the idea of gates. Gates are defensive and protective. They're not offensive. And Jesus is saying the church is different than the gates. He's saying the church is to be offensive. It's to be on the move. If anyone's on the defensive, it's hell, it's Hades, not the church. Jesus is saying we are to be on the move. The church is not to be defensive. We're not to shut the gates. We are to storm the gates. We're to go into the highways and byways. We're to invest in and engage our neighbors and coworkers and friends. We're to be people who lay it all down and travel the world to help people know Jesus. We charge the gates, not close the gates. Okay, so the implications of what Jesus is saying are fantastic. Jesus goes into the very seat of the false religion. He goes to the very place publicly known as the entrance into the underworld and even the entrance to hell. And he declares, "I'm here. I'm the Messiah. I'm the one who's going to make it possible to start reclaiming lives from the one who's trying to destroy them." He wasn't afraid to declare these things in public, and he wasn't afraid to do it amongst the very, fortifications and strongholds of the enemy. Not only that, he openly declares how he's going to go about doing it. He's going to start a whole new gathering, a whole new assembly of Jesus people who won't just gather and hole up in buildings. They won't just gather and stick to themselves. They won't just gather and build walls to keep out the big bad wolf on the other side. They will gather and they will be on the offensive. You see, I think Jesus brought them to Caesarea Philippi or Panea to tell them, we're going to storm the very gates of hell. And even in the text, there's several reasons laid out that Christians should be serious about being on the offensive and charging the gates, not erecting walls. So let's look at a few of these thoughts. But I want to take you to Jerusalem to the very gates and walls of the old city to point these reasons out. Okay, so why should we be so serious and proactive concerning helping others know Jesus? Let me share with you a couple of reasons. Reason number one, as we look at the account in Matthew 16, one thing is clear. Jesus asked his followers, who the people say that he is, and there's a lot of ambiguity. People aren't sure. Even when Jesus was walking the earth, people speculated, they guessed, they even scoffed at who they thought Jesus was. Some thought he was a reincarnated form of John the Baptist, as if that was even possible, since they had actually been alive at the same time. Some thought that he was the second coming of the prophet Elijah, or maybe even another prophet like Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. So you kind of get the picture. People were really confused about who Jesus was. And the same thing, I think, is actually going on today. Our city, Kansas City, is filled with people who literally have no clue who Jesus is, much less what he came to do. From the very beginning, before he was crucified and buried right here in Jerusalem, Jesus was interested in establishing what his people were going to do. His people were going to charge the gates of hell. His people were going to charge where everyone was naturally headed, eternity apart from God. Because if you don't know who Jesus is, then you can't enter into his rest. So here's my plea, church. Don't be duped into the terrible belief that in the end, everyone will enter into heaven. It is not true. If you don't know who he is, you can't apply what he's done. So the church is to storm the gates of hell, because eternity is a long time, and a lot of people are headed straight for the gates of hell. Second, after Jesus asked who the people thought he was, he got more personal. He asked, "Who do you think I am?" This, of course, sparked Peter's famous response that is entirely accurate, but it also demonstrates the second reason that Jesus' people are to charge the gates. Everyone will have to personally answer the question, who do you think Jesus is? This is not something that your family can take care of for you. This is not something that you can take care of for your family. Nobody gets in unless they can personally answer that they are following Jesus and that Jesus is their personal Savior. So how do they know unless someone tells them? And how will someone tell them unless they're sent? See, that's the point. We are the sent ones. Finally, there is one more reason in the text for storming the gates. God has given us everything that we need to make a difference in eternity. Jesus' final statement recorded at Caesarea Philippi is this: I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Personally, I've always struggled with understanding this part of the passage, but it seems to me that Jesus is clearly declaring to his disciples that when this new Jesus gathering begins, we will have everything that we need to make heaven available to others. We have the keys, so to speak. We know where the access to heaven is. We know where freedom from the things that keep us from heaven are found. We understand what binds us and what keeps us from God and his promises. So whatever we recognize as being bound is bound, and whatever we help be loosed through Jesus is actually loosed. We have the keys. I love this imagery because of the responsibility it communicates. I mean, think about this. Have you ever stood at a door of a home or another building waiting to get in? For me, there's nothing more frustrating than when I'm trying to get into my home, but my keys are in my pocket and my hands are very full, Now imagine that you're standing at a door and many people are desperately trying to get in, and you begin to realize why they are trying to get in. There's some sort of grave danger approaching. The people around you begin to panic, and so do you. You're hoping that you'll all be able to get inside when suddenly you realize that you have the keys to open the doors in your own pockets. But what are you going to do? Of course, you're going to move as quickly as possible to open the doors. And friends, this is the very situation that we are in as Jesus' church. We have all we need to be able to help others. You wouldn't stand there, hands in your pocket, acting as if you had nothing better to do. You wouldn't wait until the last moment to open the door, all while others were perishing. That would be foolish, and it would be cruel. So as people who have all that we need, we are the people who fight back by identifying people who are still bound and pointing them towards freedom. And we show them how their burdens and their sins can be loosed, because we have the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Finally, why did he tell his disciples not to tell anyone who he was yet? Well, it's because he wasn't interested in creating a fan club, but instead in launching a movement of people who were convinced of who he was and what he had done. So instead of stirring up a bunch of hype, telling people he was the Messiah, he went to work. Then a few months later, he died on the cross for my sins and for yours. He paid for it all. He paid for all of it. And the reality is that you aren't going to be able to enter into heaven, into His presence, without your sins being washed clean. Neither will your father, your mother, your sister, your brother, your friends, your neighbors, not even your cousin Eddie. No one can enter without knowing who Jesus is and trusting in what He did. That is why we charge the gates. Remember, God promised to send a Savior. He came. And before He accomplished the work of saving us, He established the universal church, and He promised what would happen if we followed. See, the gates can't stop us. That's a promise. So charge away. Tell somebody today. So let me just finish by talking with you about a few things that I think that we can do to actually charge the gates and make a difference. You know, these walls are defensive. The gates are defensive, but for us, we're on the offensive. So what do? First thing I think that you can do is work hard to love other people. I've found that people who are kind, people who actually care for their neighbors and love them and serve them, you know, people who pay attention to what's going on in the lives of the people around them. These are some of the people that I want to be around the most. And, you know, quite frankly, us as Christians, we could improve at that. We could work on loving people. Secondly, I already mentioned it, but one of the things that we could do is we could work hard to serve other people. You know, we could pay attention to what's going on in their lives and do whatever it takes to help them out. You know, I found that in my neighborhood, we have a new family who's moved in. They're from a different country. And when they moved in, they weren't really ready for the snow that we had over the winter. And so my boys and I got to help them. And not that that's, you know, anything special, you know, coming from us, but it meant a lot to them. And it opened a door where they started coming over, and they've been serving us. And they don't have to do that, but they have been. And so it's opening a door for us to build a relationship with them. That's what happens when you serve people. Also, I think you can invite people. You can take the time just to make a simple invite and say, hey, you know, why don't you come with me? Come check this out with me. You can invite them over. You can invite them over for dinner and talk to them about why you believe what you do. I mean, that's what happens when we love people, when we serve people, and also when we invite people. The last thing I would tell you to think about is take the time to actually pray for providential experiences, just like this. Take the time to pray for God to step in and bring people into your life and to orchestrate conversations that might not have happened otherwise. Maybe it will be at the doctor's office and the nurse asks you a question that you weren't expecting. Maybe it'll be at the supermarket and you meet somebody and you start talking and they ask you, about what's important to you. Jeremy was telling me the other day as he walked into a shop, somebody asked him about why we're called New Story, and he got to tell them about kind of why we've chosen this name, that no matter who you are, no matter where you've been, there's hope for a new story in Jesus. And they got to share with them about Christ through that. I mean, those are providential experiences. So we can love others, we can serve others, we can invite them, and we can certainly pray for providential experiences, because we are a people who are going to charge the gates. That's how we do it.